Bueno, vamos a empezar. It is my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote. Alfredo. Bueno. Dr. Federico Waitoller is an associate professor at the Department of Special Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research examines how neoliberal educational policies affect the experiences of Black and Latinx students with disabilities. He is my mentor and my friend, and I'm so excited that he's here to give his talk on, the irony of rigor, no excuses charter schools at the intersections of race and disability. Dr. Federico Waitoller.
I need to stand. I just can't stand to be sitting. So I was thinking yesterday, I'm gonna start saying thank you to all of you, but then I thought, I'm not gonna thank you because you have no choice. If you want to eat, you gotta bear with me for 45 minutes. So eat your lunch. I'm gonna try to not make you choke with what I say, but just eat carefully as I talk. I wanna also thank the National Coalition for inviting me to speak. I share a lot of the commitments with the coalitions, particularly with the commitment to intersectionality, as you will see through my work, but also commitment to have this dialectical relationship between critical practice and critical inquiry, always having a constant dance. Sometimes a smooth dance, sometimes like me, like a clumsy dance, but always having a relationship and talking to each other, because I think an organization that this has kind of worked, that doesn't engage in this relationship between critical practice and inquiry, it gets stagnated, and also their efforts can backlash the efforts and the populations that they're trying, the constituency. So I thank to them, and I'm kind of like honored and also a little humble and intimidated by the presentations that went before me. So I try to live to the expectation. I try to push the borders a little bit of complexities around intersectionality, to talk not just about intersections about race, disability, and gender, and so forth, but also talk about how they overlap with new forms of capitalism, like neoliberalism in these areas, and something that Sarah talked, as Dr. Acevedo talked before in the private talk. So my presentation today is about students with disabilities in charter schools. It's called The Irony of Rigor, and it's a small section of a larger study, of series of studies that I conducted with a team of colleagues in the city of Chicago. So I'm going to try to add complexity. So when you have in mind, when I talk about charter schools, I'm going to be unpacking this. I'm not just talking about education, but we're going to be talking about housing and urban development and how cities develop over time over the last 2 decades, and what are the implications for education, particularly for Latinx and Black students with disabilities. So this is the outline for my presentation. I'm going to start with positioning myself, because my research is my interpretations of other people's lives, and I take that, so that needs to be taken from there, and I position myself in a minute. Then I want to begin to introduce you to how I think about these so-called no excuses charter schools, and the relationship with race, disability, and neoliberalism. And we define these terms so we can unpack and we can have a common understanding of what I'm talking about. Then we'll talk a little briefly about my methods of inquiry, how I engage with research, the research questions, and then the main part of the presentation will be about these findings. It's going to be the story was one of the main themes about our research, where we interviewed 25 parents who have Latinx and Black parents who have conflict with charter schools. We interviewed our lawyers. We collected artifacts from the charter schools, and we also examined their individual education plans. And one of the main themes, not the only one, but one of the main themes that I'm going to share with you is what is called the irony of rigor. Is this double movement, contradictory double movement, in which these parents want to enroll their children with disabilities in these charter schools because they're rigor, and I want to show you why they do that. And at the same time, it's the same disciplinary rigor that I'm pushing them up and marginalizing them at the end. And I'm going to present these stories in 3 acts. Act 1, the lure of Rigor, so what it was seducing and attractive to parents to enroll their children in the schools. Act 2, the body meets Rigor, what happened when these students with disabilities experience the rigorous practices in these charter schools. And Act 3, and more consequential and important, the consequences of Rigor. What happened to the students, mentally, health, and what happened to these parents that were experiencing this disciplinary rigor as well. And then we'll engage in some sort of discussion and dialogue about what are the implications on this for the coalition and for advocacy efforts. So, as I said, I'm going to start with my positionality as a researcher. That's a photo of me in my first day of first grade. I am a male, white Hispanic from Argentina. I'm an immigrant. I came here with absolutely no English when I was 21 years old by myself. And as a white Hispanic immigrant, non-disabled, I experienced a lot of privilege, a little bit of marginalization, but I think because I'm a white male who does very well in academic settings, I experienced a lot of privilege. And this I think, research needs to be understood for that particular positionality. I've been a disability ally for about 15, 16 years. I've been a preschool inclusive teacher, a special education teacher, and then for over 10 years, I've been doing research around inclusion in public schools. So I look forward to your critiques, and because my work, it's there to be critiqued and improved. So I look forward to your comments and critiques at the end of the presentation. So let's talk about charter schools. I don't know if you know, but charter schools were not originally thought as what it looked like today. Charter schools initially were thought that to be very small, teacher-owned and community-owned schools that were free from bureaucracy, so they can innovate and experiment with new techniques, and then if they work, they will scale up those techniques to other public schools. But they've been co-opted since their beginning from this more capitalist agenda for expansion of the privatization of schools. And what we see nowadays in charter schools is not these teacher-owned, community-owned small schools, but actually these larger networks that are more concerned with expanding than with the practices of innovation itself, and with the practice of collaborating with neighborhood schools to improve educational practices around the school districts. And you see that's a graphic there that shows that charter schools from their beginning have grown from almost nothing to almost 3 million. So there's about 3 million students enrolled in charter schools at the national level. And what is important, talking about intersectionality, is that whatever happened in charter schools, we can engage in debate. They're good for students with disabilities or detrimental for students with disabilities. They do disproportionately affect Latinx and Black students with disabilities. Why? Because if you see the graph that I put there shows that while African Americans compose 2% of the total enrollment of traditional schools, they compose almost 30% of the enrollment there on charter schools. And you see that on this second graph from the right. And then in the second pair of columns, you see that Hispanic, while they compose 23% of the total traditional schools, they compose 28% of the charter schools. And this is vary from state to state and vary from city to city, but across the board, particularly in urban settings like Chicago, LA, New York, New Orleans, Black and Latinx students are disproportionately enrolled in charter schools in comparison to the traditional schools. That doesn't mean there is more numbers, but we're talking about right proportions, not raw numbers. And I think we need to contextualize charter schools with the argument and the imposition of neoliberalism in education. And I'm going to define this kind of jargony term on neoliberalism, and it's basic our current form of capitalism. And I think to unpack it simply, it has three kind of dimensions, or three kind of aspects. One economic aspect that probably you're very acquainted with, which is the deregularization of services for the expansion of markets, right? We don't want policies like ADA or the Individual with Disability Education Act, because that constrains market forces to operate and to improve schools and schools. It also pushes for the privatization of services. So from the after World War II to now, we'll see that many services from gas, electricity, hospitals, healthcare, housing, and now also education have become from a form of delivery that was state-run for a more privatized forms of delivery of social services like education, housing, and so forth. So it has an economic agenda that is based on constant capital expansion, and I'm going to show and argue why charter schools are part of this agenda. But it also has a cultural component, because neoliberal practices in schools, in work environments, tries to forge and shape subjects that are hyper-productive, interdependent, autonomous, that can act with very little support, and that they're always self-entrepreneuring themselves, and they can comply always with the cut of social services. So people are pushed to be more productive at the same time that many supports are being cut from social services. So it's this idea of homo economicus that is written there, that we are economic beings rather than wholly human beings. But it also has a political dimension that is based here. Is a photo actually of some of you protesting. It's very small, so you can't see it. But I got it from the coalition website. Because from a political perspective, even in education, neoliberalism looks for more top-down managerial approaches to governance, rather than more participatory and deliberative forms of democracy. Everything that is more democratic and participatory is found to be ineffective and time-consuming, and to mainstream and make services more efficient, we need, according to this logic, much more top-down managerial approach, something that we also see in charter schools. So now that we have this common understanding about neoliberalism, I don't think it's a stretch to say that neoliberalism is an ableist project, as it tries to push individuals to be these autonomous, independent, self-entrepreneur, and highly producer, also highly consumer, right? Because they're trying to produce not just you as a producer in the global economy, but also as a consumer that can expand that capital. It's an ableist project, and this again is done through education, through job practices, and it of course narrows the ways of being and participating, and makes participation more detrimental for people with disabilities. So charter schools, this is the no excuses charter schools. Charter schools are very broad, it's a very diverse field, we can say, but the large majority say are networks, and a lot of those networks implement this no excuses philosophy that becomes actually for this philosophy of policing called broken windows, probably if you ever hear it. The idea that if you stop small, tiny little crimes, you're going to be able to stop much larger crimes. So very small acts gets penalized very highly. And these no excuses charter schools are kind of different, and some of them, they don't like to be called no excuses for the stigmatization. But they have some common threads, and one are rigorous academic expectations that rely on standardized assessments as measure of progress, so very narrow ways of participating in the classroom and very narrow ways to assessing students' knowledge. They have a college-going culture, and also, and important for our research, have these strict and narrow disciplinary codes attached to very highly punitive consequences. And I'm going to show you some of these consequences as I show you the experiences of the parents that I'm going to share. And this is related to what Sarah was talking before, and this what these no excuses, in a sense, charter schools try to push is these norms of behavior based on white, non-disabled, middle-class norms of being in the classroom. Lining up, like the picture of there of all students lining up. There is like actually a black line on the hallway, so everybody walks in silent right next to each other to the hallway. When you're in the classroom, sitting down with your hands quiet, tracking the teacher with your eyes. And there was actually in the schools a practice called tracking, and students were forced and asked to follow the teachers with their eyes when the teacher was seeing this particular code word in the classroom. And we know that for many students with disabilities, that's a very narrow way of participating, and if we attach to that to very punitive consequences that, as I will show you in a minute, have very detrimental consequences. So we can talk about how these non-excuses charter schools fulfill these economic, cultural, and political goals of neoliberalism in a way from the economic standpoint to redistribute educational opportunities through private means, because yes, charter schools are publicly funded, but they are privately run. And even those charter schools who are non-profit, they outsource all their services to educational management organizations, which are for profit. So the idea that I think that charter schools are public schools, I think is highly debatable. I would rather call them publicly funded than public schools. And they also try to deregularize, and they have a lot of tensions with the Individuals with Disability Education Act, because they constrain the kind of actions they can do. But also it has this cultural component that try to force producers and consumers for the market economy to the strict practices that I was mentioning before. And also from a political standpoint, they apply this top-down management, because there is no parent participation, there is no PTA in charter school. It's a management organization top-down that makes the decision, that are corporate run even outside the school campus. And as I mentioned, these have particularly have concerns for students with disabilities, because historically, charter schools have lower enrollments of students with disabilities across the board. And this, to be fair, has been catching up. So the new data shows that kind of charter schools, in percentage, are kind of behaving similarly than traditional public schools. But the one study that we did recently within a statistical analysis of the composition of students with disabilities in charter schools and the composition of students with disabilities in neighborhood schools, only shows that the composition is very different. So when you look at charter schools, it's mostly students that will demand them to do very little changes to their narrow practices, like students with mild learning disabilities, for example. While neighborhood schools have much larger proportions of students who may demand charter schools a more restructured and higher an extensive change of their practice, like students with intellectual disabilities or students with autism. So they also have lower numbers, and mostly with students who doesn't demand many supports. But also there have been a lot of concerns and lawsuits around misservices of students with disabilities in charter schools. Here's the Southern Poverty Law Center that has a standing still court case called Fast Track. There have been many other cases around the nation. I used another newspaper of a parent from New Jersey, the charter school not providing educational services. And there also been a lot of concern about student-away practices. Student-away practice, also called push-out practices, are these implicit or explicit actions that charter schools engage with to get students with disabilities out of their school. Why? Because in a sense, yes, they demand more support and more economic investment from the school, but it also, students with disabilities diminish the symbolic status of the school, because the test scores of that school may go down. So when parents are shopping for schools, we'll see that that school doesn't get as good test scores as they may like. So it diminishes the symbolic status, the symbolic understanding and perception of parents for charter schools, because we live right now in an educational market where parents choose schools through school choice through different options. So schools are now, for example, in Chicago and many other districts, compete for students. And in many districts like Chicago, the money is attached to the student. So it's not you have a certain amount of teachers per school or a certain amount of block money, but if you lose your student, you lose that money. So you want to keep your students enrolled. So I'm gonna skip this. I'm gonna go fast on this, because another aspect of neoliberalism is this idea of use capital for urban space for capital accumulation. And what we have seen in Chicago, here in Austin too, if I'm not mistaken, and people from Austin may want to talk about this later, is this idea to reappropriate those spaces that were deemed as unsafe, or where Black and Latinx working class used to live, and reappropriating for building luxury condos through gentrification, or renovating river walks, like in the case of Chicago, or Millennium Park. But some areas of the city have received a lot of investment through this, and this is state, probably tax money given to corporations to invest this capital and expand capital, but also redevelop some areas of the city. But some areas, like the one on the upper and the lower right corner, have received no investment at all. And I'm going to show you a map in a minute. So we see this kind of creative destruction, in a sense, what it's called, what we call in some academics, where state-run forms of services are destroyed to create opportunities for private-run services. And here we see a photo of some bricks from a neighborhood school taken up to put up in a charter school. So I want to show you a map very quick, and I want to get to my findings. But this map, I've been engaged in a lot of mapping technology to show, and I know that this is a barrier for some people that are not able to perceive the maps, but they're very telling as well. And these maps, what they show, and I'll try to describe it as much as I can, is there are three maps, one that shows where charter schools are located, one where it shows magnet schools, and when closed schools are located. On the background of these maps, you see different shades of colors that demonstrate the different kind of investment that those areas of the city have received. So you see on the yellow ones up top, those are middle class and upper class areas of Chicago. The green ones are areas of gentrification or prime for gentrification. The blue ones are areas that since the 1970s have been in extreme poverty with very little movement, since 1970 for 40 years. And the brown shades are areas that used to be middle-class Latinx and Black areas, and over time, due to lack of this investment, they have become areas of poverty. So these are areas of decline. So what you see there briefly is in the first one, charter schools predominantly are in areas of gentrification, in areas of extreme poverty, and areas of serious decline, that now are areas of poverty. While magnet and selective enrollments tend to focus on areas of gentrification and middle class. And you see the closed schools because part of this marketization of education is closing the schools that are not producing results, and also schools that are losing enrollment. In Chicago, we have closed over 100 schools since 2000. And you see those schools are cramming in areas of extreme poverty and gentrification. So you see an overlap on one way where charter schools are open and where neighborhood schools are being closed, that creative destruction that I was talking before. And also you see how charter schools are used to redevelop some areas of gentrification through the open of charter schools and also selective enrollment as a way to attract middle-class parents to come to these areas of the city, because education plays a key role in real estate development and renewing the city to bring qualified middle-class, usually white but also Black and Latinx, back to the city to live and create more tax revenue. So we have this idea, just to before I go to the study itself, that we have the destruction of the neighborhood schools, the creation of these new schools, particularly in areas of gentrification and poverty, where students are asked to comply with these very narrow no excuses practices. So my team and I were interested to understand how Latinx and Black parents and their children with disabilities experience these processes of marketizing education, particularly how they experience these no excuses charter schools. So here's a quick slide about the study itself, and I can expand later on about the research design. But basically, we partner with a legal service organization, that's a pseudonym that is there for confidentiality for our participants. So that's Disability Legal Advocates, that they have this particular clinic that serve parents who have conflicts with charter schools. So we recruited from them. We interviewed about 25 parents, they're lawyers. We examined IEPs, individual education plans, and also school artifacts. So here is when it comes to the story, because these parents were very attractive to these schools that market themselves with rigor. And I'm going to go through these three acts: the lure of rigor, then we talk about the body means rigor, and then the consequences of rigor. So Act 1, the lure of rigor. So this idea that parents were searching for safety was because they feel that in their areas where they live, were not finding safety. And they perceive those areas as not safe for their children with disabilities to walk through to the neighborhood school, or even to go to the neighborhood school where he may experience gun violence. So I'm going to talk about two areas, the areas of economic disinvestment that I was talking before, and areas of gentrification. I'm going to give you some examples of this, about dismantling of public housing and also the rise of rents and displacement that happen when gentrification occurs, because as gentrification attracts more middle class and upper class to area of the city, rent and property goes up, and many low-income working class communities get displaced to farther west and south of the city. And another important thing that parents mentioned is this idea of access to college, right? This idea that they wanted their kid to be part of the market economy, they wanted to access these rigorous practices, to be disciplined enough and academically apt enough to be able to enroll in college. So here's a quote from a parent believing in of this investment. This is an area, again, that have received very little investment, that over time have decayed. There used to be a middle class in the middle class black area in the 1970s, and by now it's an area of extreme poverty. So she says, it's the hood. Even before I moved here, it's considered, pardon my language, the host role. Prostitution, prostitute stocks, walk up and down. There is a motel right here in this corner. They take Jones. That is this neighborhood. There's a lot of drug activity. To me, it was in too close proximity to the neighborhood school, and especially when you're talking about a special needs child who doesn't talk. So Chanel was a mother of a student with autism, and we can critique what she says. That I think what we need to get from here is her perception of safety in the neighborhood that's been shaped through these areas of investment and disinvestment from the city. And she was looking at a school that had provided some safety for their children. Wendy was a Dominican mother, used to live in an area that got gentrified and used to live with her mother there. And due to the high rents and displacement that occurred through gentrification, had to move to an area farther west where she perceived as non-safety for her children. So she decided not to send their children to a neighborhood school and was looking for safety in the charter school. So she says gentrification is dominant over there. You have to have money to stay over there. That's where she used to. At one point, because I used to live in Garden Square apartments across the street, it was a big building. That building was a rental building. Now it's all condos. You walk around the neighborhood, you see mostly Caucasian, pale faces, more than you do people of color, which is the typical Dominican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Panamanian, that they will look black, but they're still Latino. Now the rent is high. You can't live over there. You want a 3-bedroom, you have to have at least $2,000 plus, $2,500 to live over there. That is what it is. They are pushing us farther and farther west. And she had to move farther and farther west, and her children, she had 3 children with disabilities. She decided to go in the neighborhood school in fear of gun violence, the charter school in fear of gun violence. So this appearance of the charter school was always on this parent discourse. So here's a parent that amidst this search for safety, these areas created for investment and disinvestment in the city, they saw this charter school, these new buildings with new young staff and better rigorous disciplinary practices, almost like an oasis, like a great opportunity for them. So she's Veronica, another Latinx mother, saying, when the kids would go in and out of the class, they were all in line. It wasn't like chaos where they just send the kids out. Okay, you go to the next class. No, the kids, they had to be in line. Oh my goodness, if they wouldn't suffer big consequences, like sitting out in recess, sitting them alone in lunch, calling home, bringing parents in. And charter schools, I mean, she mentioned some of the things that charter schools, but both there was a lot of disciplinary community practices of, for example, not letting kids to go to special parties that the school had because they didn't have certain test scores or had misbehaved that day. But also economic punishment. There was one charter school, novel charter school, that started, that traditionally had charged money to low-income parents every time that the student broke the code of conduct of the school. And I interviewed a parent that they wouldn't let their child graduate because she was owing like $3,000 on demerits that she was being charged by the charter school. That practice has changed in the last year. Our punitive practices have continued, but just to be fair, say that they're not charging parents anymore, but charter schools were charging $10 to $20 to $50 to parents for every time that their children were breaking the code of conduct. So for many students with disabilities, with this narrow disciplinary practice, of course, are in much more likelihood that their parents are going to be paying this kind of demerits. And then quickly, how I mentioned, it's not just the rigor, but it's access to college, right? This access to college as a symbol to their kids to becoming part of the market economy. That's what's very important for parents. And it was blasted by all form of market by the charter school. All the handbooks, publicities, commercials of these charter schools were advertises. We have 100% college acceptance. We give you scholarships. Every single classroom was named after a big school like Harvard and Yale. And this is not just in high school. I'm talking even in kindergarten, that kids were apprenticed in to do everything possible to go to college. But of course, the body then meets these rigorous practices. So here's Veronica again. Classes started, she started second grade, but the teacher, that's the way that their guests they're told to teach. Everybody the same. Everybody have to keep up. If not, of course, you suffer the consequences. My daughter started being fearful that, oh my gosh, I don't remember the spelling words. Oh my goodness, I forgot my book at school. I was thinking about social studies and I forgot the notes for math. Oh my goodness, where did I leave my notes? Mom, I don't remember. Can you try to call somebody? My goodness, it went on and on and on, and she started suffering the consequences. Mr. Lopez, she's disturbing in class. Mr. Lopez, she's not following directions. She's getting distracted. She's not finishing her homework. This student, actually, I'll show you some of the consequences, but this student was a student that had a psychiatric diagnosis of anxiety and a mood disorder, and that's how she was diagnosed at least. I don't know how she identified herself because I didn't get to talk, I talked to her parent. But this student ended up in a therapeutic facility out of the stress and anxiety that she suffered from not complying from these normative practices. But this rigor was not this rigor alone, and this involved a much larger part of the project, but I wanted to have also the big picture. This rigor was coupled with, this punitive rigor was coupled with denying and denying services for students with disabilities, all the supports, aides, social workers, therapists, also complying with IP measures, like letting kids to have fidgeting toys on their heads that were denied, and also lack of trained personnel, and also to the point that some suggesting the parents to leave the schools because the student was not doing good in that school. So then you have a disabling practices, that a disabling context in where highly punitive, narrow, rigid practices with very little support. And of course the consequences, and I mentioned just a few. Half of the parents that I interviewed left the school, but guess what? They went to another charter school. Because, again, because the areas in where they live that have been disinvested economically and educationally, they could not make themselves to send their children with disability to the neighborhood school. Mostly in these areas of disinvestment and gentrification, mostly because of safety. The escalation of the students' responses and behaviors became worse. Anxiety and depression in many of the students. The students dislike school. Some students couldn't even stand up to go to school out of depression. A lot of parents' trust on school got lost. And as I say, many of the students about 8 students ended up in a therapeutic facility. There is other severe cases that I don't want to share, but every time that I finish an interview, I have to sit down in my car like for 40 minutes and just sit there in silence because the stories were compelling and also very unfortunate. So here's a quote from Veronica. Started getting worse to the point that I could not get her up from bed anymore. She couldn't go down to school anymore. Here's another quote from Kimberly. I feel that the charter school should be accountable for counseling a 6-year-old at the time to high levels of anxiety the way they did. He started biting his fingernails off and pulling his hair out. I strongly believe that the doctors say also that it came from being depressed and not knowing what was going on in school, not knowing able to follow what was going on in the regular CNLD class. Some students suffer this, one student that attempted to jump out of the window actually. So there were some extreme stories and some mild stories and everything in between. But definitely affected the mental health of the students. But also the parents, because these parents, a lot of them were experiencing also they were searching for jobs, they experienced housing instability. So this idea that parents are going to become these rational consumers in search for the best school for their children is totally fantasy, because some of these parents are concerned about where they're going to sleep that night, or how they're going to get a car to go to work, because that's their concern for the day, not into try to shop around 5, 6, 7 schools around the neighborhood, if they have so, to choose the better school for their children. So here's a quote from Simone. She was under so much stress that then this with the housing and then my own health going down. So many of these parents also have disabilities, and they were taking care of grandparents with disabilities. I couldn't take it anymore, and I just dropped the ball, and I just gave up. I just couldn't keep. It was overwhelming, so bad that my health was going down. This is from the parent. This parent actually ended up going to another charter school. Didn't want to even. She had a lawyer and stopped the lawyer. She didn't want to deal with that anymore. Just moved to another school. So discussion. So what do we make out of this? Out of these rigorous practices, this also around these areas of investment and disinvestment and gentrification in the city, and how this affect parents of students with disabilities perceptions of schools, and how they engage with this educational market. Well, I think there is, in the irony of rigors too, just to revise what I was trying to demonstrate to you, we have this uneven geographical development within urban settings, when there's areas of investment, disinvestment, and gentrification that affects parents' perceptions of safety, that then affect how they think about schools and why they choose charter schools. They can these new private, new building, young staff with these rigorous practices to be marketed to these parents. And the promises, right, the fantasies that the children, through this rigorous practice, can access the market economy to access through college. And then through the same rigorous practice that are so attractive to, they suffer these consequences like push out and also students and parents' health. And I think there's this contradiction of students with disabilities and what I call the paradox of neoliberalism in education, because students with disabilities and in general people with disabilities within capitalism, they offer the opportunity for market expansion because they're deemed as deficient and lack enough the skills to contribute to the market economy, and therefore you have all these private services and tools and technologies that creates the opportunity for market expansions to be marketed to people and students with disabilities so they can participate in the market economy. But at the same time, it's a paradox, because if they offer to the market this opportunity for capital expansion, they're a threat to the ideal of the neoliberal subject. They're a threat to being this hyper-productive with little support, with little legal and social support, to be this hyper-consumer, hyper-productive, autonomous, independent subject. So, recommendation for the coalition or advocacy organizations. I think we need to look at complex forms of resistance that, of course, look at intersections of race, disability, but also interconnected and multiple social issues. So when you go and advocate for immigration, when you go and advocate for education, when you go for through uneven economic development in cities, you gotta connect, and you need to create coalitions through different agencies that work across those sectors, because those sectors are tightly connected, as I was trying to demonstrate. So building this strategic analysis, not just across race and different markers of difference, but also around different sectors that deals with different injustices across, because these injustices intersect, in my case, in students with disabilities life. They just don't experience injustice in education. Those injustices in education multiply, not add, I think the word is multiply, with other injustices around houses, economic development, and social services. And I think we need to have, and I think Catherine Perez talked about this on Friday, we need to be visionary than reactionary. I work with a lot of special ed advocates in Chicago public schools, and they're always reacting, right? They're reacting to withdrawing funding from special ed, or they're not giving services to kids. And my question always to them is, where is your vision for disability-based education, right? I'm not a fan per se of special education, which is an irony because I'm a special ed professor, but I think special education as a separate and segregated system have done more harm than good to students with disabilities. And we can engage in that debate, and I welcome the conversation. But the problem per se is not a special education. What we need to think about is the general education classroom, because that's where exclusion originates in the first place. So while many disability study scholars always push for the dismantling of special education as a radical form of inclusion, I will argue that actually we need to work with the general education classroom to dismantle the barriers and create learning spaces where everybody can participate, and multiple forms of being and talking, and multiple forms of identities and respected value and used for those cultural repertoires used for learning purposes. And through doing so, my vision and for students with disabilities, at the special education we don't need to dismantle, but it will become obsolete. It will become no longer needed. And I think we need to move beyond special education, and we need to, talking about this economic, cultural, and political aspects of neoliberalism, we need to try to exorcise those forms out of schools, and we need to bring more just forms of redistribution and recognition of different cultural repertoires, including disability as culture, and more representation of students and parents with disabilities in schools. And I'm going to stop there, and I would love to hear your comments. Here are my contacts. People told me that I should be more on Facebook, so if you want to friend me, I can be your friend in Facebook, whatever that means these days. So that is my information, and I welcome your comments and thoughts. Thank you. Okay.
Maybe we can answer a couple of questions. We'll go a little bit over. The microphone's right there.
I'll start. Again, my name is Stephen. I'm with a nonprofit organization here in Texas, Disability Rights Texas, and actually I work in the space of public education and advocacy for students with disabilities. And I'll start where you ended about a vision for special education. 100% agree that it should not be a segregated place, a segregated system, and the place to really start is general education, public education, and move more towards inclusion and integration. But that being said, I'm curious about the specific question about charter schools. And when you talked about the parents who had to withdraw from a charter school, but more likely then turn to another charter school, my question for you is what can we ask or should demand from public schools so that the parents feel that is a viable option or alternative to go back? Have you thoughts about that?
Yeah, and it depends, again, the parent perceptions, I only focus on this presentation on parent perceptions living in areas of gentrification and areas of poverty. It was kind of interesting because parents living in Latinx and Black parents living in middle class areas, they were not concerned about safety. They were concerned about segregation in separate classrooms mostly. And that's the reason that they didn't want to go to public schools. Chicago has a pretty bad reputation about segregating students, particularly those who need more extensive support needs. But I mean, there's different options, yes. And this presentation is a critique to charter schools. If you see our entire project, it's actually also a critique to the entire system, because these parents are going to charter schools because Chicago public schools, the neighborhood schools, have failed them for decades. And their perceptions are quite right in my understanding, because some of the schools are very detrimental for students with disabilities. So yes, the transformation is to go in every single school. An idea of inclusion, but not inclusion through accommodations and modifications, because to me, that's a medical model of inclusion that rather doesn't change or transform the practice of the school, but just tweaks things around to assimilate the student with a disability, but rather a radical transformation of practices based on universal principles and cultural sustaining principles that can transform the schools in places where they're not about developing workers for the market economy, that are in places that sustain and help students to sustain and critique and develop their own identities in all in their intersectionalities. And I can expand on that by then. There's one question here.
Wonderful presentation. I was wondering, what are your thoughts about ethnic studies?
Mm-hmm. Ethnic studies in general?
Well, would it be important to be included in your work, in your research?
Absolutely. So my work intersects on race and disability, and I couldn't get to all the stuff that I do here. but I try to fuse what I call ethnic studies. I come from a tradition called cultural sustaining pedagogies. So how we help students to sustain their own cultural, disability, gender, religious identity through schooling, but also without being naive, right? With creating critical reflexivity, because if we don't critique our own identities, we also through our cultural practices, we ended up marginalizing other people, right? Because we know, for example, I'm always critiquing my colleagues on ethnic studies because they pay zero attention to disability and they don't understand disability as culture. So they're doing all these curriculums and pedagogies, all based on being Hispanic and Black and all the cultural repertoires that those groups bring, that completely ignore their intersectionalities with disability. So I think both needs to be fused and they need to inform and critique each other.
Bueno, I think we're time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Don't just make one.
So as you can tell, we're running about 10 minutes late, but we're still going to give you guys a break. So please come back here in about 10 minutes. We'll have one more breakout session. So this room will have mentorship and workforce with Dani Martinez and Benigno Aceves. And then the Elm room will have community and disability with Yolanda Vargas, sorry. So yeah, we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Se me olvida.